Thank you.
And thanks to you at home for staying with us for the next hour. When Bill Clinton was running for re-election in 1996, you may remember that his campaign theme that year was building a bridge to the 21st century. That campaign theme worked. Bill Clinton, of course, was re-elected. And at his second inaugural address, he kept the theme going. It was all bridge, 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 end of this century, start of a new one, over and over again.
My fellow citizens, at this last presidential inauguration of the 20th century, let us lift our eyes toward the challenges that await us in the next century. Let us build our bridge. A bridge wide enough and strong enough for every American to cross over from the height of this place and the summit of this century. Let us go forth.
I love inaugural addresses. I love all inaugural addresses, no matter the president. But as a theme for a campaign and for a re-election and a second term, that whole heading into a new century thing made sense because we were in the late 1990s, zooming toward the 2000s. So new century, new millennia, that whole thing was very big at the time. Right? 2000, 000, party over, out of time. Right, okay. Right, okay. Party like it's 1999. We all had with the whole Y2K freak out. It was all very zeitgeisty at the time. Chronologically, the whole idea of bridge to the 21st century made sense as a 90s campaign slogan. But then, having survived Y2K, having eaten all the food we stored, having crossed over into the new century, having made it now through the first decade of the new century, and having started into the second decade of the new century, today, the man who would like to be the next president of the United States and who has a pretty good shot at it, declared the start of a new century. Today, in 2011, either 89 years early or 11 years late, depending on what you think he meant.
Let me make this very clear. As President of the United States, I will devote myself to an American century. This century must be an American century. In an American century, America has the strongest economy and the strongest military in the world. In an American century, America leads the free world, and the free world leads the entire world. The 21st century can and must be an American century.
Mitt Romney, the current frontrunner for the Republican nomination, depending on how Rick Perry and Herman Cain are doing today. Mitt Romney chose today, the 10th anniversary of the start of the Afghanistan war, to declare his big vision of America in the world. Despite choosing the 10-year anniversary of the Afghanistan war as the occasion for this big speech, he did not actually say anything about Afghanistan in the speech. Substantively, he said if elected president, he would convene a group to study the issue.
I'll order a full review of our transition to the Afghan military to secure that nation's sovereignty from the tyranny of the Taliban. I'll speak with our generals in the field and receive the best recommendations of our military commanders.
On the war's 10-year anniversary, that is his big idea on Afghanistan. I will look into it. But mostly the big Mitt Romney, next Republican president vision rollout this week was about making this big speech today and making the announcement of his very long list of foreign policy advisors, which actually explains why he was talking about a new American century 89 years before it's due.
In an American century, America leads the free world, and the free world leads the entire world. The 21st century can and must be an American century.
Of the 22 people who Mitt Romney has now named as his foreign policy advisors, 15 of them are people who worked on foreign policy under the George W. Bush administration. 15 of the 22. About a half dozen of them are former members of the Project for the New American Century. Remember them? Project for the New American Century was the neoconservative think tank that was arguing for an American invasion of Iraq all the way back into the 1990s. And again, for them, like for Bill Clinton, the names sort of made sense since they started before the end of the last century, talking about a new American century. The group did survive, though, for a hot minute into the 2000s. 9 days after 9/11, they are the ones who wrote to President Bush saying Saddam Hussein might have helped in the 9/11 attacks. And even if Saddam didn't help, any counterterrorism strategy after 9/11 that didn't include invading Iraq, quote, will constitute an early and perhaps decisive surrender. The project for the new American century has folded now, for obvious reasons. Their website is still up, though. It's like a time capsule of I Was Wrong Incorporated. All this Saddam did 9/11 stuff, and we'll remake the Middle East in our own image, and we'll be greeted as liberators and all the rest of it. Seriously, visit it sometime. It is like a time travel back to the worst losing arguments in foreign policy in the last decade. Having been so discredited by the Iraq War disaster, the project for the new American century people closed up shop. They did basically reopen under a different name, the rather obscure name Foreign Policy Initiative, which I think not by accident is much less Googleable than their old name. But with the greatest foreign policy failure in American history hung around their necks, with the project for the new American century neocon fantasy a punchline now, Mitt Romney, as a presidential candidate, has decided to embrace them. Romney picked 6 new American century guys and 3 of the 4 board members of the new group that replaced it to be his advisors on foreign policy. He is essentially set on reconstituting the major parts of the George W. Bush foreign policy apparatus. He's even picked the ones that you would think could really never work in Washington again. For example, do you remember the lie making it into President Bush's State of the Union address?
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
The whole uranium from Africa thing is traced back in the Bush administration in terms of who they blamed for that getting into that speech. It's traced back to a man named Robert Joseph. He was the specific guy in the White House who reportedly pushed the White House to include the uranium from Africa thing in that Bush speech. Saddam Hussein was not seeking uranium from Africa. That was not true. It should not have been in the State of the Union address. It should not have been used as evidence for why we should go to war. And if you were the guy responsible for that, I mean, we do not banish people in this country. You're not going to be exiled. But you know what you can't work on anymore? You can't work on anymore talking about people getting uranium from Africa. You can't be that guy. You can't work on proliferation anymore. It is the one thing on which you have not only discredited yourself, but by your actions, you basically discredited our entire country. You can work on anything you want. You can become a color by numbers genius. You can invent a new form of recycling container. You can write amazing sci-fi novels. You could be a stay-at-home dad. But you cannot work on the whole weapons of mass destruction thing anymore if you are the uranium from Africa guy. That is the one thing you cannot do. Mitt Romney has just named the uranium from Africa guy co-chair of his counter-proliferation working group. The uranium from Africa guy is going to be Mitt Romney's uranium from Africa guy. That's like hiring John Ensign to be your marriage counselor. This would be like hiring somebody from Blackwater to advise you on sane, forward-looking foreign policy. Oh, wait. Cofer Black, the former CIA official who left in the middle of the Bush presidency to go become an executive at Blackwater, he has also now been named a Mitt Romney foreign policy advisor. Mitt Romney also picked up Dan Senor, the guy who the Bush administration sent over to be the spokesman for the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. A former staffer for the Coalition Provisional Authority acknowledged that Mr. Senor's press office would send out targeted good news about the war press releases to the American media during the 2004 presidential campaign in order to deflect criticism of President Bush. Once somebody has admitted that you did that in war on behalf of your country, you're never supposed to be able to work in politics again. The Washington Times, which is not a mainstream newspaper, but is a conservative newspaper and therefore gets a lot of conservatives to talk to them. The Washington Times found a prominent conservative foreign policy observer today to give this assessment of Mitt Romney's newly announced list of who's advising him on foreign policy. Quote, there are some good people on this list and some crappy people. It's like they stood on a street corner and screamed, who doesn't have a job? Turns out a lot of people who don't have jobs in this field don't have jobs because of what they did in this field during the George W. Bush administration, what they did to the world and what they did to the country. But Mitt Romney has given them a soft landing on the 10th anniversary of the start of a war that is still going on. To be fair to George W. Bush, when George W. Bush announced the start of the Afghanistan war 10 years ago, he did counsel patience.
Given the nature and reach of our enemies, we will win this conflict by the patient accumulation of successes, by meeting a series of challenges with determination and will and purpose. In the months ahead, our patience will be one of our strengths.
in the months ahead. By patience, President Bush counseled that it might take months. When that administration was thinking about starting a new war on top of the one that was still going on in Afghanistan, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld told the American public to sit tight. In December of 2002, he said everything was looking pretty good in Afghanistan. Asked by CNN's Larry King, what's the current situation in Afghanistan, Secretary Rumsfeld replied, it is encouraging. The Taliban are gone. The al-Qaeda are gone. That was 9 years ago. Right now, there are roughly 100,000 Americans still in Afghanistan. President Obama's current plan would have them out not by the end of this year, not by the end of next year, not by the end of the year after that, but by the end of 2014. We have never had a decade-long war in this country before. Afghanistan became the longest war in American history last summer. So we are in uncharted territory in terms of what we are asking America's military and military families to do on our behalf. The Pew Research Center just polled Iraq and Afghanistan veterans about the wars and about America's life during wartime. 50% of Iraq and Afghanistan vets say the Afghanistan war was worth fighting. 50% of them say it was. 50% of them say it wasn't. That's more than the country at large, but not much more. Here's the really striking thing, though, that has really far-reaching consequences for us as a country. Not just for what we've done, but for what we do next. If you ask Iraq and Afghanistan veterans about the distance between people in the military and their families who've been at war for 10 solid years now, if you ask about the distance between them and the rest of the country, if you ask Iraq and Afghanistan veterans if after 10 years of the military fighting these wars, the rest of the country understands military personnel, if you ask them whether the public at large gets them and their families and their issues right now, 84% of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans say no. That is horrifying. That chasm, this yawning gap between American civilian life and the American military's life in the last 10 years is horrifying. The radically different experiences in the 10 years since 9/11 for military families and for non-military families, that is a fundamental change to who we are and for who we will be moving forward. Joining us now is Soufan, former FBI special agent whose interrogation proved the first 9/11 link to al-Qaeda just after the attacks, the link that led to the start of the Afghanistan war. His new book, of course, is called The Black Banners, the inside story of 9/11 and the war against al-Qaeda. Soufan, it is great to have you back. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You were there, literally there in the room as we connected 9/11 to al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda to Afghanistan, and eventually thus started the Afghanistan war. Given that start and our goals then, does it make sense to you that 10 years on, we still plan to have tens of thousands of troops there for years to come?
It's interesting. If you asked me that when we figured out that al-Qaeda was behind the attacks of 9/11 and on the eve of the Afghanistan war, I could have told you now. It's really impossible to think that 10 years later we're still in Afghanistan. And the Afghanistan war lasted more than World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War. This is really interesting phenomena. And as you mentioned, it's a new charted water for us.
When you think about this as a counterterrorism specialist, and you as an FBI special agent really became a counterterrorism operative at the highest levels, the whole idea of why we are still there in Afghanistan is counterinsurgency, is the idea that our presence will provide security and essentially build up Afghan institutions so that the Afghan people want their government more than they want this insurgency, and that will have an effect on whether or not that society still produces terrorists that can pose a threat to us. Do you see those things as linked? Do you believe that argument? Does it work for you?
No, I truly don't believe that argument, especially when it comes to Afghanistan. I don't believe in the argument of nation-state building in Afghanistan. You know, Afghanistan is divided into many different factions, many different tribal factions, many different ethnic factions. You have the Uzbeks, you have the Tajik, you have the Hazara, who are Shiites, you have the Pashtun. The Pashtun tribes, they are divided between northern Pashtun and southern Pashtun. And if you look at the landscape 10 years later, of at least from the insurgency side, you have the Taliban. And not all the Taliban are Mullah Omar Taliban. There are different factions based on tribal and clans and so forth. But also there's the Haqqani network. And the Haqqani network don't actually represent Haqqani network. They are the proxy for Pakistan and the ISI in Afghanistan. So there's a lot of regional issues that we have to take into consideration, a lot of tribal issues that we have to take into consideration, a lot of ethnic issues that we have to take into consideration. For example, the Hazara, their loyalty is to Iran, and Iran has a lot of control over them. The Uzbeks, they have very strong relationship with Russia. The Tajik, they have very strong relationship with Tajikistan and with different allies that they have in Central Asia. Haqqani, Jalaluddin Haqqani. Jalaluddin Haqqani, historically, from as early as the Soviet jihad in Afghanistan, he was the ISI's main man. He was the deputy of Galbuddin Hikmatyar. Maybe a lot of people forget that name, but that name was very important in Afghanistan during the Soviet jihad. And after the Soviets left Afghanistan in 1989, the leaders of the Mujahideen start fighting with each other. The Pakistanis said, look, we cannot tolerate this is happening in Afghanistan because Afghanistan is a strategic depth into Pakistan. So they created what we know the Taliban today under Mullah Omar. And the moment they created the Taliban and the Taliban took over Kabul and defeated all the other leaders of the Mujahideen, immediately Haqqani switched alliances and he became part of the Taliban because the ISI asked him to be part of the Taliban, and Mullah Omar gave him a position as a minister for tribal affairs in the very first Taliban government. So now the strategy that we have in Afghanistan is basically a strategy to pull out in 2014. The Pakistan strategy is how they can have their proxy in control of Afghanistan after we pull out, and that's what we see today, that struggle that's happening and the emergence of Haqqani network as a major player in Afghanistan.
And in the absence of an indefinite American presence and us adopting Afghanistan as the 51st state, there's no effect that we're going to have on that complex.
You know, these people have been killing each other for hundreds of years, and they will continue, unfortunately, to kill each other for hundreds of years. We need to leave, but we need to leave in a way that we can guarantee that Afghanistan won't be a launch pad for transnational terrorist groups to attack the West and attack the United States. So in order to have these security guarantees, we have to have regional agreements and tribal agreements in the country. You can put 200,000 troops in Afghanistan, and that's not going to make a difference.
The book is called Black Banners, The Inside Story of 9/11 and the War Against Al-Qaeda. Ali, because you are here, I have to ask you something personally as a favor. I have been using your book essentially as an almanac since it came out. Will you publish an e-book-like version of an index for this book? There's no freaking index in this book, and I'm constantly looking stuff up in it, and it really stops me for hours.
Well, that's actually a very good question.
Is Cofer Black? Now that he's been picked by Mitt Romney, Cofer Black stars in your book. You need an index, dude.
Well, we had an index. However, the CIA, as part of the redaction, pulled it out, and they said that we cannot put the index. We cannot even put a picture of me and my wife in the book, in heaven's sake. But as I mentioned in the very first page of the book, we're working on that, and we're hoping all the redactions will be taken care of, and we're hoping that the index that we have, but it's considered old redacted, will be part of the book.
I may start producing a wiki index just of Mitt Romney advisors in your book between now and then. Don't rush me. Ali Soufan, thank you so much for being here. It's good to see you, sir.
Thank you.